elderly man who thought his son was taking him to a nursing home got out of the car and was completely stunned. He saw something that left you speechless. Please comment on where you are hearing from. And if you like inspiring stories like this, subscribe and press the bell for more interesting stories to come. Edward Ramirez, a 70-year-old widower living in Austin, Texas, sat by the window of his small room, watching the bustling city streets below. Once a proud and independent man, Edward now found himself grappling with the weight of age and loneliness. He had moved in with his adopted son, Miguel, and Miguel's wife, Isabella, after losing his beloved wife, Clara. While they had welcomed him into their home, Edward couldn't shake the feeling that he was an unwelcome burden. The room he occupied had once belonged to his grandson, now repurposed to accommodate him. Each morning, Miguel and Isabella rushed off to work, their goodbyes hurried and their attention elsewhere. Meals were often left on the counter by a kind neighbor, Teresa, who occasionally voiced her concerns. "They don't really want you here, Edward," she had once said, her tone tinged with sympathy. Her words lingered, amplifying the guilt Edward already carried. Though Miguel assured him otherwise, Edward's heart felt heavy. He longed for purpose, but felt invisible and unnecessary in the vibrant household. His memories drifted back to the life he had built with Clara, a life filled with love and laughter, now reduced to ashes. Haunted by his past and disheartened by his present, Edward began to consider a nursing home, not as exile, but as a way to ease the burden on his family. Edward Ramirez had lived a life rich with love and purpose, built alongside his late wife, Clara. Together, they had created a home in San Antonio filled with warmth and cherished memories. Edward adopted Miguel, Clara's son from a previous relationship, and the bond between them grew stronger with each passing year. Their modest house became a sanctuary, a testament to their hard work and devotion. Edward worked the land, tending to his flourishing garden with his loyal horse Estrella by his side, while Clara filled the home with laughter and love. But everything changed one fateful night. A power outage had left their home in darkness, and Edward lit a candle to push back the gloom. Exhausted from a long day of work, he fell asleep on the sofa, unaware of the danger. Hours later, he awoke to thick, choking smoke. Neighbors rushed in, pulling him to safety, but it was too late for the house. The fire consumed everything: Clara's belongings, family photographs, and the very essence of their shared life. When Edward regained consciousness in the hospital weeks later, he was told he was lucky to be alive. Yet he didn't feel lucky. He felt hollow. The house was gone, and with it, a part of his soul. Miguel took Edward to Austin to recover, offering his home as refuge. But life in Miguel's bustling household was far from what Edward had hoped. He carried the weight of his loss daily, haunted by memories of Clara and the life they had built together. Edward felt as if the fire had taken not just his home, but also his purpose, leaving him dependent on his son and yearning for the past. Edward Ramirez's sense of isolation deepened with each passing day. Living in his son Miguel's bustling household, he often felt like a silent observer, rather than a cherished member of the family. The days were long, and the evenings even longer, filled with an oppressive silence that only amplified his loneliness. His birthday came and went without much fanfare. A slice of cake left by the kind neighbor Teresa, and a brief birthday from Miguel and Isabella before they rushed off to work. The solitude that day weighed heavily on Edward, serving as a painful reminder of how disconnected he felt. The guilt of living in his grandson's former room gnawed at him. Each glance at the empty walls and packed away toys reminded him that his presence had displaced someone else. The few moments of warmth he shared with Teresa were often overshadowed by her blunt observations. "They don't have time for you, Edward," she had said once, her words cutting deeper than she realized. Unable to endure the growing sense of uselessness, Edward made a decision. One evening, after dinner, he confronted Miguel in the kitchen. "Take me to a nursing home," Edward said, his voice steady but filled with sorrow. "Sell my land in San Antonio and use the money to pay for it. I don't want to be a burden anymore." Miguel sighed, brushing off the request with a vague promise to discuss it later. Edward's frustration simmered, his pleas ignored, and his heart growing heavier. Feeling invisible and unwanted, Edward began to accept that if Miguel wouldn't take him, he would find a way to go himself. Anything to relieve his family of the weight he thought he had become. One bright Saturday morning, Edward Ramirez sat in his room, lost in thought, when his son Miguel entered with an air of quiet determination. In his hands, Miguel carried a crisp white shirt, a pair of neatly folded slacks, and a new set of toiletries. Following close behind was Isabella, her arms full of fresh towels and linens. "Pack your things, Papa," Miguel said, his voice steady but unreadable. "We're going on a trip." Edward froze, his hands trembling as he clutched a worn photograph of his late wife Clara. The words hung in the air, filling him with a bittersweet mix of relief and sorrow. He nodded silently, not daring to meet Miguel's gaze. Edward had pleaded with his son countless times to take him to a nursing home, believing it to be the best solution for everyone. Now, it seemed, Miguel had finally agreed. Edward packed quickly, his movements deliberate and precise. With each carefully folded piece of clothing, the weight of finality settled on his heart. The last item he placed in his suitcase was Clara's photograph, tucking it safely on top. As he zipped the bag closed, it felt like he was saying goodbye not just to his family, but to the life he once knew. The car ride began in silence, the hum of the engine the only sound. Edward sat in the back seat, gripping his suitcase tightly, his knuckles white against the fabric. Miguel focused on the road ahead, while Isabella gazed out the window, a faint smile playing on her lips. To Edward, her smile felt out of place, too joyful for what he believed was a somber occasion. As they left Austin behind, the scenery began to change. Towering skyscrapers gave way to rolling hills and open farmland, the landscape a patchwork of wildflowers, weathered fences, and ancient oak trees. Each sight stirred a mix of emotions in Edward. The peaceful countryside reminded him of his younger days with Clara, of drives through the fields where they dreamed of growing old together. Those memories now felt like another life one that had been lost in the fire. Edward's heart raced as they turned onto a winding road surrounded by dense trees. There were no signs of houses or civilization, only the endless stretch of asphalt disappearing into the horizon. Swallowing hard, he finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Where are we going?" Miguel glanced at him in the rearview mirror, a cryptic smile on his lips. "You'll see," he said, offering no further explanation. Edward resigned himself to the unknown, bracing for what he believed would be his final chapter. As the car came to a stop, Edward Ramirez clutched his suitcase, his heart pounding in anticipation. He hesitated before stepping out, bracing himself for the sight of a nursing home, cold, gray, and unfamiliar. Instead, when his feet touched the gravel, he froze in disbelief. Before him stood a house he knew all too well, his childhood home in San Antonio, fully restored. The charred ruins he had left behind after the devastating fire were gone. In their place stood a gleaming white house that looked as if it had been plucked straight from his memories. The porch railings were freshly painted, the windows sparkled in the sunlight, and the familiar shape of the house stirred emotions he thought he had buried long ago. Edward's legs buckled as the weight of the moment hit him, and Miguel quickly caught him. "Careful, Papa," Miguel said softly, steadying his father. What is this?" Edward stammered, his voice trembling. Miguel's eyes glistened with emotion as he smiled. "Welcome home, Papa." Edward's gaze darted around the property, taking in every detail. The sturdy porch, the smooth paint, the scent of pine and varnish. Each element spoke of care, love, and effort. Overwhelmed, he allowed Miguel to guide him inside, where the surprises continued. The interior mirrored the home Edward had shared with Clara. Warm tones on the walls, polished wood floors, and furniture that radiated familiarity. On the mantel above the fireplace sat a single framed photograph of him and Clara on their wedding day. Tears streamed down Edward's face as the realization sank in. His family hadn't abandoned him. They had rebuilt not just his house, but the very essence of his life, restoring hope and love he thought he had lost forever. Stepping into the restored house, Edward Ramirez felt as if he had walked into a living memory. The scent of fresh pine mingled with a faint hint of varnish, and sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating a space that felt both new and deeply familiar. His eyes darted around, taking in the polished wooden floors and the warm tones on the walls, each detail echoing the home he had built with Clara. Then his gaze landed on the fireplace mantel, and his breath caught. A framed photograph of him and Clara on their wedding day rested in the center, their smiles frozen in time. Edward's hands trembled as Miguel led him further inside, revealing more pieces of his past carefully preserved. Cherished belongings charred but salvaged from the fire had been lovingly restored. An old brass clock ticked softly on a shelf. Edward ran his fingers over each item, the memories flooding back with a bittersweet intensity. Just as he thought his heart could take no more, a familiar sound reached his ears, a gentle whinny that sent a shiver down his spine. Edward froze, his eyes widening as he turned toward the open door. "Is that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Miguel smiled and gestured for him to step outside. Edward shuffled to the porch, his heart pounding. There, standing near a newly built post by the garden, was Palomo, his loyal horse. The stallion's coat gleamed in the sunlight, his mane freshly brushed, and his dark eyes seemed to recognize Edward instantly. Tears streamed down Edward's face as he hurried down the steps, his legs moving faster than they had in years. "Palomo!" Edward exclaimed, wrapping his arms around the horse's sturdy neck. The warmth of the animal's body against his own, the familiar scent of the earth and hay, filled Edward with a profound sense of peace. Isabella joined Miguel on the porch, watching the reunion with a smile. "The neighbors found him after the fire," she explained softly. "They took care of him until we could bring him back." As Edward stroked Palomo's mane, tears mixed with laughter escaped his lips. In that moment, surrounded by his restored home, his cherished belongings, and his faithful companion, Edward felt something he hadn't in years, whole. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, Edward Ramirez sat in his old armchair near the fireplace, its soft fabric now restored to the same design Clara had chosen years ago. The room glowed warmly, the gentle flicker of firelight dancing on the polished wood and cherished items surrounding him. Edward's hands rested on the arms of the chair, his fingers brushing over the familiar texture, but his mind was swirling with emotions he could barely contain. Across from him, Miguel knelt down, his eyes filled with both pride and vulnerability. "Papa," Miguel began, his voice thick with emotion, "we never planned to send you to a nursing home. That was never even a thought." Edward looked at him, his expression a mixture of confusion and guilt. Then, "Why didn't you tell me? Why let me believe I was just in the way?" Miguel reached out and placed a reassuring hand on his father's knee. "We couldn't tell you because we wanted this to be a surprise. We wanted you to see this home, the life you built with Clara, exactly the way it should be whole. It was never about you being a burden. You've never been a burden, Papa." Edward's throat tightened, and he looked down at his hands, ashamed of the doubts he had carried. Miguel continued, his voice unwavering. When the fire happened, we knew how much this house meant to you, how much it represented. You and Clara built a life here, and that life deserved to be preserved. So, we made it our mission to rebuild it for you. But the land, Edward interjected, his voice trailing off. Miguel smiled softly, shaking his head. You didn't sell the land, Papa. The papers you signed months ago? Those were construction permits. We needed your approval to start rebuilding. Everything you see here, the walls, the beams, even the smallest details, they were all made possible because of your love for this home. Isabella, who had been standing quietly nearby, stepped forward, placing a hand on Edward's shoulder. It wasn't just us either. The neighbors helped too. Everyone remembered what this house meant to you and Clara. They wanted to give back to the man who always gave so much to others. Tears welled up in Edward's eyes as he looked at Miguel and Isabella. I thought you were trying to push me away, that you wanted me gone. Miguel's voice grew even gentler. Papa, you raised me. You took me in when you didn't have to, and gave me a life I never would have had without you. You've done so much for me, for all of us. Restoring this house was the least we could do to show you how much we love you. Edward's tears spilled over as he reached out and pulled his son into a tight embrace. His voice cracked as he whispered, I'm so sorry, mijo. I let my loneliness blind me. I doubted you when I shouldn't have. Miguel pulled back just enough to meet Edward's gaze, his expression filled with sincerity. You've never been a burden, Papa. You've always been our foundation. Overwhelmed with gratitude and love, Edward looked around the room again, seeing not just a house, but a labor of love. A testament to the bond he shared with his family. For the first time in years, his heart felt light, the weight of loneliness replaced by an unshakable sense of belonging. The home wasn't just rebuilt in wood and stone, it was rebuilt in love. As Edward Ramirez sat in his old armchair, Miguel approached with a small leather-bound book in his hands. The cover was worn but intact, and Miguel's expression was soft as he handed it to his father. I found this while sorting through the things we saved after the fire, Miguel said quietly. It's Clara's journal. Edward's hands trembled as he opened the book, revealing pages filled with Clara's neat handwriting. Each word seemed to leap off the page, wrapping him in the warmth of her love. The journal chronicled their life together, the simple moments they had shared, dreams they had nurtured, and her unwavering love for him. Edward's eyes filled with tears as he read entries about their garden, their evenings on the porch, and the laughter they had built their life upon. She wanted this house to always feel like home, Miguel said softly, sitting beside him. I thought you should have this, so her voice could always be with you. Edward clutched the journal to his chest, tears streaming down his face. Thank you, mijo, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. In that moment, surrounded by love and Clara's words, Edward felt an unshakable sense of peace and connection. Edward Ramirez began unpacking his belongings, his heart lighter than it had been in years. Each item he placed in his restored home seemed to bring him closer to rediscovering a sense of purpose and belonging. On the mantel, he carefully arranged cherished photographs, including one of Clara smiling in their beloved garden. Beside it, he placed keepsakes that carried their shared memories, a carved woman's flower, a captive cat bear, a king crow. Each piece spoke of a life filled with love and meaning. As Edward reached the bottom of his suitcase, he found a folded envelope addressed to Miguel. It was a letter he had written during one of his loneliest nights in Austin, apologizing for being a burden and asking for forgiveness. Edward stared at the letter for a long moment, then slowly tore it into pieces. No more doubts, he murmured to himself. I know my place now. With that symbolic act, Edward let go of his guilt and embraced the love his family had shown him. For the first time in years, he felt truly at home, surrounded by love and peace. As the evening settled into a peaceful hush, Edward Ramirez stepped out onto the porch of his newly rebuilt home. The cool night air carried the faint scent of wildflowers and earth, and the distant sound of crickets filled the silence. Nearby, Palomo grazed quietly, the loyal horse lifting his head as Edward approached. Running his hand along Palomo's mane, Edward smiled, his voice soft as he spoke. "We're home, Palomo," he said, his words full of gratitude and wonder, "and it's better than I ever imagined." Looking back at the house, Edward took in every detail, the freshly painted walls, the sparkling windows, and the porch that felt like an old friend. Each plank and beam represented not just a physical structure, but the unwavering love and dedication of his family. Miguel and Isabella had given him more than a house. They had given him back a life he'd thought he had lost forever. Later, as Edward sat on the porch with his photo album in hand, flipping through pages of cherished memories, his heart felt full for the first time in years. He thought of Clara, of their dreams, and of the family they had built together. "I thought I had lost everything," he murmured, gazing at the twinkling stars above, "but I've gained even more." Surrounded by love, purpose, and belonging, Edward felt truly alive. The house wasn't just a place to live, it was a testament to the love that had rebuilt his life. Please share your thoughts in the comment section below. I'd like to hear your thoughts on this touching story. Please like if you like this story, and we will see you in the next video. Before you leave, don't forget to subscribe and press the bell.